Hi, I'm Susan Carew. I'm from Happiness, Australia, and I'm inviting you to step into my global agora. This is the place where democracy first started. Initially, it was actually about senators coming together in the Greek agoras, they were mostly males. Of course, today's global agora is about everybody, and this includes children, the elderly, disabled. Everyone is welcome into this agora. I don't mind your nationality, don't mind your age. Everyone is welcome because this is, in a sense, a platform to encourage everybody to speak up in our world. We are most definitely at a turning point globally. That turning point not only is a political turning point, it's also an ecological turning point where we have to change. That is beyond doubt. We have to change. Now, whenever people are confronted with the idea of change, there's resistance to it because they get afraid. They're used to things being a certain way and change looks very frightening. But in actual fact, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to experience life. I know this in my own life. I've had a lot of change. I've, lived in lots of places. I've had lots of changes in my personal life. I've changed from, education, university, into business life, from business life into really my own sovereignty, I suppose you'd call it, independence. So change for me has been normal. So uncertainty in my life is normal. In a lot of people's lives, they avoid uncertainty as they seek to control and make things smooth. And I understand that. But in this global agora, what I want to talk about is a message particularly to Australians at this time, because we are at a precipice of having a major political change in the sense of the dissolving of democracy. And it's been done very subtly, but it's most definitely happening. Now, the reason I know this is that I'm old enough to remember a democratic society when I was a child. Now, I want to describe for the young people who don't know anything about earlier times. We had free transport, we had free healthcare, we had free education here in Australia, inclusive of university education. In those days, not everybody was made to work. Unemployment was the Commonwealth Employment Service that was owned by the government. They simply had boards up. People go and have a look at the board and go for a job. They weren't in any way having to comply with ticking boxes, becoming very active in order to have this mutual obligation that we see today. There was no mutual obligation. The government provided social security, which is the rule under the Constitution. That's its job. And the reason why social security was provided was to create stability in a society, because employment could not always be full employment. That means not everybody can be guaranteed a job. Not possible because of economic conditions. What does that mean? It means when you're a trading nation like Australia and you're a small nation, you are very much impacted by global trading conditions. So the stock market's confidence, the price of labour, as they call it, which I've never really felt comfortable with. That's your wages that you're paid. In economic terms, you're called the price of labour. Your cost of production, sadly. That's the nature of the economic system. It works off supply and demand. It is a system that was originally designed to allocate resources more fairly through a price system based on demand and supply. The idea was to manufacture things to benefit the people. The democratic system back there was much more open to different voices, although always there are voices who want to shut down openness or who want to control the discussion, and they might do that through the media. Media is owned by various interests who have a certain belief that they want people to believe. So they want to influence public opinion. We see that in the media. It's very obvious. Whereas I'm interested in people having their own opinion, which means being independent. It means going out and finding out from good sources, sources that are honest is what I mean. Not my sources necessarily. You find your own sources and decide what's true. You have to research what's going on in the world. Now, going back to when I was growing up, kids played outside. We weren't on computers. You know, back then we had the phones that you actually dialed. Some of those of you who are my age will remember that. We all had landlines. We didn't have mobiles. We didn't have computers. Television, I can remember, went from black and white to colour. I actually remember that. I can even remember pennies that we had here in Australia before it went to, you know, the main digital currency, or not digital, the, you know, 20s, 10s, 20s, dollars, although the currency back then was dollar notes. There was even $2 notes and $5 notes, $10 notes. I don't even think we had $100 notes, I'm not sure. Right back in the beginning. I lived in Canberra, so the mint was who actually printed that money. We used to play a lot. There was an innocence in that time, not as cynical as it is today. People were very friendly. Like you see people plugged in today, as they walk past you, they don't even acknowledge you. When I was growing up, people acknowledged each other all the time. We used to always say hello. You know, I got to know my neighbours. Poor neighbours got to hear us yelling, but families were also very, let's say, vocal at times in Australia anyway. What I loved about growing up here was it was a lot freer. We did have a very good standard of living because this is a very abundant country. There's sort of a friendliness, as I said, in the people. We're also pretty bombastic too, you know. We can get pretty aggressive when we think we're right. You know, I've seen a lot of guys and women fighting because, you know, and they're not usually based on much fact, maybe a few beers or... So I grew up in the working class, you know. This is the mainstream. And we had lots of discussions. I know around my family, we actually did sit around the table. We didn't have a television in every room, and we didn't have specific meals for specific people. Everyone ate at the table. And there was this idea of respect for older people and parents. You know, we weren't answering back. Oh, we did actually. That's not true. We did answer back, but not as much as today, you know. So that was sort of the Australia of my youth, very free. We all spoke up. You know, we're all pretty wild, I think, in those days, 60s, 70s and 80s. Music was really great. There was a lot of freedom, is my point. So that's very much part of who I am, which is why I'm doing the video. Because what I'm seeing today is a shutting down of voices, which is not the Australia that we want. I'm certain of that. There's a conservatism, and all conservatism is, in my view, is a lack of experience. These people have very strong viewpoints. They tend to poo-hoo people breaking out and being themselves or spontaneous. That's seen as, you know, unruly, not disciplined. They tend to frown, you know, on the more free, loving people. And that's okay too. That's diversity in our society. So I don't particularly wish to, you know, isolate. I'll probably more or less just emphasise things from my perspective, but bearing in mind that everyone has a right to be who they are. So I'm not here to shut them down either. I'm just saying that I'm recognising from a base of pretty free society to one that's becoming increasingly conservative, where we're not so tolerant of differences, where if you don't have money, you're relegated as a loser, and I totally don't agree with that at all. Everybody has different life experiences. We're all here for different reasons. You don't know the purpose of that person's life, what they're here to learn. And that's probably taking it from more of a metaphysical perspective. If you look more deeply at life, we have purpose. Someone comes into your life, makes a real difference to you. That's the purpose in your life. That person was meant to come into your life. These are the sort of narratives that you won't hear on the terrestrial television. Pardon me. So, again, going back to the society today, we're now in a global reality. It's more digital. There's a lot more talk today of the cyber reality, and people think that's a very exciting future reality. For me personally, I see it as another way of having us all connected. I have a deep concern around surveillance of citizens, which we saw through Edward Snowden's film, the film about Edward Snowden, and how he spoke up about the military's and government intrusion into the personal lives of all of us. Now, they have programs where they can access your emails, they can access your phone, you might be talking to someone, you're texting, and we see the same thing replicating out with this personalisation. You might want to Google that in IT. And what it is some sort of algorithms where they can see what you're looking at on the internet, they can see your patterns, they can put ads, they personalise ads that they think you're interested in, and then you can get influenced into buying more stuff. Now, because it's personalised, you're being targeted. It's not like a mass, advertising campaign that everybody gets to see, on occasion. You're actually being targeted and you don't even know it. I'm not in favour of that, particularly with children, because we're seeing the possibilities of that emerging in classrooms with more computerisation. Also, over-monitoring of people to know what their interests are, their hobbies are. If, for example, a young person speaks politically or says something foolish that might sound violent, then that's recorded for life. It's like, that is really concerning. Young people make lots of mistakes, so do silly old people make mistakes because they get heated up and they blast off. And then that becomes how you're personalised, how you're profiled. Well, this is not fair and this is too intrusive. People have to be free to make their mistakes without it becoming a global situation where their information is recorded. And if in the later date they become high profile, then this stuff can all come out. We don't want that. I don't want that. God, some of the silly things I did when I was a teenager, the last thing I would want is a YouTube video of that. But in a world that's still very immature, in my view, where we still demonise people, where there's these little wars going on, political wars going on, the shutting down of the opposition when they're supposed to be there as a part of creating honesty in government. That's the whole point of an opposition. But what I'm saying is that there's this demonisation of the left, demonisation of the right. We've got one group representing the business community, one group here in Australia representing the unions and some social justice issues. But by and large, there's a whole raft of people who are not represented at all. If you're not in business, if you're not a worker, well, then you lose out on occupational health and safety. You have less rights. If you don't have money and let's say you have to go to court, you can't afford a lawyer, and if legal aid do not decide to fund you because their criteria is getting narrowed and they're also getting funding cuts, which I find very interesting given there's a lot of money, that they can be fully funded, that disempowers people who don't have a lot of money. So we end up again with this notion of the haves and the have-nots. Now, Australia was a very egalitarian society. We had quite a large middle class. But since we've become far more business-oriented, We have become more globalised. Everyone's shunted into work. If you don't work, you're somehow outside, you're lazy. We come up with all these words to demonise those who don't join in for whatever the reason. They might have mental health issues. They might be artists, you know. They could be uninterested in sitting at a desk for 7 or 8 hours a day doing boring work. So what happens is propaganda. These people are pressured into going back into work because people make money off that. Government gets taxes, business has productivity, they make profits. Those aren't distributed to the workers, I'll note, which I believe they should be. I think every business enterprise should have its profits distributed amongst its staff, given that they are the ones that produce it. And they often come up with the ideas, but they don't get to own them. I don't believe in people taking work home. I think you should work 9 to 5 and that's it. Australians work probably the hardest in the world. And I've seen that. I've worked in 400 workplaces myself, and I've seen how hard people work. I've also seen people have it easy as well. Depends on the job. But let's just say that it's sped up in the workforce. When I was at university, we talked about the leisure society. The idea with IT was to actually give us more time to have leisure, to have fun, to relax. In Australia, Trades Hall here in Melbourne was the first to come up with the 888, which is 8 hours of work, 8 hours of leisure, 8 hours of sleep. This is called balance. It's not just exercising free market doctrines where we get what they call flexible, workforces. So what that means essentially is you put everyone under contract. You might cancel their contract if you decide you don't like what they're doing. You might find global conditions change and you don't want to have to pay them money. So you say, sorry, you're on contract, we'll let you know when we need you. Well, how does that make them, pay the rent or the mortgage? How can they survive if their contract is only sort of actioned when they're needed? This is called the casualisation of work. Then we've got people on salaries who are earning huge amounts of money. Anything from, say, $80,000 right up to $800,000 to $1 million if you're a CEO, maybe more. In some of the top multinationals, they'll be earning heaps. These people want for nothing, but there is a price to that. They also have to work incredibly hard, and they have the worry of the business constantly with them. Professional people work very, very hard, and they get down career trajectories. They go down these trajectories. There's real impacts on their families. And the same with the working class too. They don't have time to spend with their families. They spend more time with their colleagues than they do with their families. This is why the families are breaking up, because they're overworking. They have nothing. If you don't give everything to the job, they consider you're not serious, that you're not serious about your career. Well, that's a ridiculous belief. Business community should be very much interested in balance. They talk about work-life balance, but I mean it for real, where you actually don't have people overworking and you pay them overtime. We've lost that as well. This is when you put them on salaries, they don't get overtime. We had really great conditions here in Australia 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I remember. We had, for example, the national wage case, I remember that. We had an industrial relations system, I think was the envy of the world. All wages were set in order to be fair. And this is another really important aspect of Australia, advance Australia fair. That's what made us egalitarian. We were fair, and the unions arose because of the excesses of business. And then they get turned into an enemy because they critique. By the same token, some of them can be bullies. I've worked in unions myself. In a temporary capacity, I've also worked with employers, and I've also been an employer. It's all about respect, ultimately, between those two dynamics, for the employers to understand there is necessary for there to be a voice for the working people, because they often don't feel they can speak up at work because they're frightened of losing their jobs. They're very compliant. It's not democratic at work. There were terms such as industrial democracy that were raised many years ago, and the idea was to give people more of a say in the workplace. There are some enlightened business leaders that I've noticed who have actually given more say to their staff. There's also delegation, where people are working more in flatter structures of units, teams. That's a little bit more progressive. But to not sack people or get rid of people because they bring up issues. This is a democracy. And I, for one, am claiming my democracy. I am not letting go of my democracy. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not going to be silent. No way. And I'll say to people, the more silent you are, that's a tacit consent to having no voice. Government watches that. They see whether you're actually speaking up or not. Now, when you speak up, you don't have to be aggressive. We can resolve conflict by saying, this is my viewpoint. I recognise that this is your viewpoint. What options can we generate? We were meant to clash it up. It was never meant to be a dictatorial scenario where you shut down people who differ from you, who speak up and say, actually, I want fairness in this. You don't just ignore them. That's what dictators do. They ignore other people. We have in the workplace an OH&S system which is here to resolve conflict. We actually have resolution procedures that people are supposed to enter when they have a conflict. Now, I have witnessed cases where this is not at all being actioned, and I have had the mask removed from those in power for me. And I have been completely shocked by what I've seen. I thought I was not understood in some of the conflicts that I've had, but I was. I was actually ignored. Even when there was an offer of, let's sit down and discuss this, this was ignored. This is how people become more communicative. This is why people speak up. This is why people blow whistles. Now, we've got this new legislation that's just come out, foreign espionage legislation. Andrew Wilkie, the MP in Tasmania, is talking about the possibility that people could protest and be arrested under the ASIO Act during John Howard's time. People were able to be picked up for 14 days without a judge. I repeat, this is a democracy, is it not? That for me is not a good sign. When I hear people discussing that you can go to jail if you impact economic interests, that raises my concern. Does that mean that we can't speak up if there's corruption in an economic entity such as an organisation? If it's a foreign multinational and they're here, let's say they're corrupt, let's say they're giving donations and expecting special favours, does that mean we can't speak up? Does that mean we go to jail for 20 years? I would like a public debate on this. I would like to know more about the changes in discrimination legislation, the changes in privacy legislation, freedom of information. Why is there a cost to it? Everyone should be accessing their information from government for free. The other issue of subcontracting government services or selling them off is a massive issue for Australians. That means FOI disappears if, let's say, Social Security becomes privatised, and we've certainly seen the job search area, the job providers, that's all been privatised. These are private companies that are running that. That means you don't have a say because it's no longer government. When it was government, we had a say. Under freedom of information, we're supposed to be able to access our own information. I'm finding that that's not necessarily working in all cases. What happens when the organisation doesn't want to give over its information? What if they're hiding something? How do you access that information? How do you get support? If you've got regulators who are saying, well, you have to put in your complaint within 12 months, most cases people won't have even put a complaint in within a 12-month period because they don't even know what's going on. They start to realise what's been done to them. And then they'll say they haven't got the resources to take on your complaint. This does not inspire a feeling that we're living in a society that is really supporting the public. The public kind of feel like they're on the periphery. There are so many issues that need to be discussed in society. We need to have public forums to talk about things like, for example, speeding fines. We need to look at the cost of that. Is that fair? Everything has to come from a perspective of fairness. Is this fair, given that people are on different incomes? A speeding fine for a person who's in poverty could mean not eating for a few weeks. Why is it that we're paying the same amount? Why isn't it a percentage so that it's fairer? Why do we have congestion in all our capital cities? Why do we all start at the same time? Why don't we have flexi time? So you start when you want to, but you clock on and you do 7 hours. Then you clock off. Everybody has different biorhythms. Why don't we have job share? So then we get fuller employment. Another really important question is why don't we have a global basic income for everybody so that your electricity, your rent or mortgage, probably rents I would say, they probably wouldn't fund mortgages, but let's just say as a starting point, your basics are all covered, everybody. The dollar's gone. So then, therefore, we've got an inequality that disappears. We can't just look at people and say, well, you're a dole bludger. I'm working. I'm a decent person. Well, that's not true. There's a lot of decent people out there who aren't working, and there's a lot of indecent people who are. So it works both ways. You can't just judge people by the fact they work or they don't work. So let's equalise our society and maximise potential for happiness. We're here to be happy. Gross domestic product is what we calculate all the products and services in our society. We call it GDP. This is a national income, national wealth. Yet GDP does not factor in the damage to the environment. We would actually increase GDP in cleaning up the environment because it costs us more to clean it up. It becomes someone's income, or it's a product. You're selling a service such as cleaning up pollution. That becomes a good thing from a GDP point of view, but it's a bad thing environmentally. We're damaging the environment and we're saying that this is wealth. It's not. We're actually undermining the very support systems of our society. So we need to factor into a new equation. We have to deflate GDP in respect of the damage we're doing to the soils, to the air, to the minerals that we're extracting. What impact is that having on the actual planet itself? Planet works from the basis of homeostasis, balance. Everything's balanced. It communicates fully. But it communicates for the greater whole. It's not like an internet type system that connects everybody, which is not necessarily working for the greater whole. It's working for various interests who want to know what's going on. I use that as a comparison because until we start to think more in terms of nature, that we're all one, we're in one world, that what we do to others we do to ourselves, that violence is counterproductive, it's a call for help, it's an imbalance. We get angry because we're believing things that we've been taught and then we divide off from each other. We demonise people, we believe the media. The media are not accurate. They're not. It's not like they're doing a research project and giving you the full facts. They're not. They're usually sound bites for 10 seconds and then we all decide that that's true. Well, it's not. You know, the conflicts around the world are failures. Even though people are profiting from it and saying, well, this is great, there's more conflict, we make more money. It's not great for those people on the ground who are under bombs. It's not great when the hospitals are bombed. They can't even get medical help. It's not great when the children see their family murdered. This is not great. This is the extension of power, and it's very clever. It creates more enemies so that we all get distracted and we think, oh yeah, that's a threat to us. It's not. The threat to us is when we create enemies. We draw what we think about to us. The more you attack something, the more you empower it. From a peace perspective, to disempower anything, you have to face it. You have to speak up. But you do it in a way where you're not hurting other people. Speaking up is absolutely necessary for peace on this planet. You can bury your head in the sand and say, oh, well, I've got no power. That's a totally untrue statement. You've got plenty of power. I myself travelled the world on very little money. If I can do it, you can do it. I went and taught peace. I went 20 countries. I clowned on the streets, brought a lot of happiness to people. Went to orphanages and nursing homes. I've been into jails. I've met people from all walks of life. I've been in Muslim countries. I've been communist countries, democratic countries, Buddhist countries. I've had a look at a lot of it. We're all more similar than we are different. It's a lot of misunderstanding, and it gets fueled by those who have a vested interest in dividing people. Those who have a vested interest in suppressing the voice of people for their own selfish interests because they don't know how to share. They've disconnected the heart because they're over-identifying with the intellect, getting very clever, but they don't have much emotional intelligence, which means I see myself in you. You are me. That's emotional intelligence. I feel empathy for you. Bullying can't exist if people are happy and they feel empathy. That empathy comes from learning community, in families, in communities. But if we shut all this down with these cyber realities, we overwork people, people become isolated. Even at work, even in a family, they become isolated as they get shut down. That is not what we want. We want to hear from the community. We want to hear your voice. It's very important, but not in forums where we're putting people down. You're the enemy. You don't agree with me. No, everyone has a right to a different opinion. I could have a military person sitting here. That's fine. I've sat with military people, had a chat. I've found peacemakers within the military. So they're not my enemy. But what I do believe is they need to speak up too about what they are witnessing. Is this security or is this business interest? They have to get really clear about this because they may lose their lives for it. What about the failures in the diplomatic area? Or the wheeling and dealing rather than resolving the conflict. We're not seeing an underlying resolution of conflict. We see people trading. I'll bargain this for that. We'll give you access to this or that. That's how they think resolution occurs. It's not. You have to identify what the fear is. You de-escalate that fear. Friendship-ism, Patch Adams talked about. He's a clown. Robin Williams played him in the movie Patch Adams. Highly recommended to have a look at. He was humanitarian. I travelled to Russia with him. He went to Russia to try and build a bridge between the United States and Russia. This was a creative intervention to build a bridge of friendship. He was very successful at that. He met with, it was actually Maria, who was a Russian artist, who wrote to Patch out of a Russian-English dictionary and asked him to come. It was all because of her that he came to Russia. And then he brought a whole bunch of clowns with him, and they went to the orphanages and nursing homes and on the streets to build friendship-ism, he calls it. We need to build bridges in the world, not blow them up. I want to say to people that the money is not the be-all and end-all of this life, not at all. We're here to live a life. Who knows, we probably go on. Certainly in some of the stuff I've read, we do. What you do with your life matters. You are not inconsequential, not one of you. You are all very powerful. You are all incredibly talented. I have not met one person yet who's not great, not one. I've been amazed at the resiliency of how people deal with life. It's not easy. I've just been blown away by women and how they carry not only full-time jobs, but they also raise kids. You know, I've met some extraordinary people in my life who I've really admired. We can learn so much from each other, but we waste so much time in unresolved conflict. We could be out exploring space, but instead we've got all these conflicts around the planet because people at the top don't know how to build those bridges. They don't know how to communicate and relate to that other. I know that's true. I've talked to some soldiers who told me that some of the problems have been that cultures are not understood. There have been problems of military interventions where it was misunderstood. So there was a belief that one side was on the other side, and so they went in believing that they were allies. These other two sides were allies when they weren't. I won't go into the conflicts because I don't want to particularly create more conflict. You know, there have been major problems in the way that we have carried out military interventions in countries, decimating whole populations. 90% of fatalities civilian. That's got to be a serious issue. We invest so much money, billions. Australia's earmarked $200 billion over the next 10 years in the military here. We are a small country of what, 24 million? That's 20% of global military spending. Australia is earmarking. Why? Is that going to bring peace to the Asia-Pacific region? Is it going to escalate tensions? Who are the multinational companies? And they are actually listed on the parliamentary website. The Senate here in Australia has actually passed legislation where government has to now show all the subcontractors. It's well worth having a look. Millions, if not billions, are going out into pursuits that need to be debated publicly because it's taxpayer money. Things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership needs to be debated, even though it's been signed off. Is it true that a multinational can sue the Australian government if they cancel their contract? Well, what if they're corrupt? Does that mean we've got no say whatsoever as an Australian public? Are you kidding me? Anything that causes harm has to be questioned. Anything. If we all become shut down, we might as well go back to Nazi Germany because that was all about fascism. That was all about shutting down opposition. The Stasi, Yugoslavia. How many countries have had secret police knocking on doors? Do we want that here in Australia? Police have to also ask questions. Do they want to obey orders if those orders are coming from multinational companies, not the Australian government? That needs to be questioned. Is that happening? We have to become more active as citizens. That's an absolute duty that we have as citizens, to question our government. Now, if that winds up 20 years in jail, well, go and jail 24 million people. Is that advancing Australia fair? Something to contemplate. So I'll leave you with all of that in my global agora as I sit here shaking my head. I want a democracy. I'm living a democracy. And I do know, I have to say, I have to finish on with some humour. I know that when people start to repress their societies, it never works. So you can have some heart in that. Always empires fall. That is an absolute given, because the people always had power. But the people don't know it until they get forced into a corner where they know they have to stand up, and it's often at the last moment that people actually get up. I highly advise you to get up before the last moment. Take care. Bye.